Alrighty. Okay, hopefully that is started. I just given my consent. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me tonight. Thank you, Shrikant, for inviting me. I think this is a tremendous opportunity, you know, to just kind of reflect on all the work that I have done and then have an opportunity to share my experiences. So as Shrikant has introduced, I am currently a BI solution architect working for Costco. And for many years, I've been a very hands-on developer. So some of my interests, I love data, dealing with data. So it's always about data. Little do you know, I'm also very, very interested in people. So Shrikant, you might not remember, I actually do have a degree in psychology as well, because I was very curious about people and how we all work, right? And I'm also because I'm dealing with data, I'm very interested in, how do you communicate well using data? So a lot of my work has been, learning about data visualizations and data storytelling frameworks. And then also, as part of my job, right, I have to love to solve business problems with the solutions that I build. And then last but not least, this is what I go to work for, I think, right, is to see happy and excited and delighted customers, right, who wants to come back and use my solutions over and over again. So I kind of want to share my journey with you, right? Given my earlier role as a developer, I spent a lot of time doing UI design. So dealing with, picking the right fonts, making sure the sizes are readable, lining things up. There's quite a bit of rules for lining data up, especially. How do you order things in a certain way? We debate on colors a lot. How do I make some page actions obvious for my end users? Also think about, how do you design differently for mobile and desktop interfaces? And then also a part of my work, very important part is doing a lot of standardizing and templatizing so that we can do a lot more and faster. Now, but what I did realize after doing that for a while was that, well, these are all great exercises and these are all very important activities that you have to do. But I've noticed that not all my customers are always happy. Why? What is missing in my work? How come they're not happy or not satisfied? So, I start to think that, well, doing all these things are great, right? Looking at the technology behind the scenes to make things work is very important. And when you talk about the interfaces, right, thinking about how the users would interact with your solution is definitely very important. But a lot of times we miss some of the obvious questions and we forget to ask them. Things like, well, why did the user ask for this? What are the users really after when they ask you these things, right? Am I actually solving their problem? Sometimes you do build solutions and it didn't quite hit the mark in solving problems. Do my users know how to use that solution once I give it to them? Do they know how to get to it? Do they even know that it exists? So no wonder some of my users are not always happy, right? Because frankly, I did miss the mark on some of these questions when I look back. So UX and UI design, right? The way that I kind of digest it and think about it is that, yes, user interfaces are very, very crucial, right? But it is only a part of your solution. Doing it well will certainly facilitate good user experiences. Now, the user experience design, on the other hand, right, comes in and addresses why you want to put those interfaces together for your users. So I think this quote differentiates UI and UX very nicely. So UI is the saddle, the stirrups, and the reins, and UX is the feeling that you get being able to ride the horse. So let's dig into the topic of user interfaces, right? In the digital context, our minds go straight to being a technologist and we think about these things. Well, are you going to be using a mouse or using your finger to navigate? Is it going to be on a desktop screen or on a mobile device? Do you need to think about the power of the devices? Would the OS differences, cause any issues, and you have to consider those? Thinking about responsive design. Do you want to design for a single screen experience or multi-screen experience? Sometimes, is it a single device experience or multi-device experience? So now, with those things in the background as context, right? Now you can think about the actual designing of the user interfaces. And you will have to cover 4 key components when you think about the designs. Number 1 is your input controls. Secondly is your navigation components. Thirdly, the information components. And then lastly, thinking about the containers. So input controls, these are used for by the users to put information into a system or to give instructions to your system. So things like your checkboxes, radio buttons, sliders, input text fields, drop-down menus, those are all input controls. Now, when you're designing and determining what to use, you want to make sure that you make the call to action, and you will see this abbreviation CTA, is extremely clear to the users. You want the users to know where they can do something, right? You want to make that really obvious to them. So buttons, right, that are meant to be clicked should look different. Fields that you want users to input should also be very apparent. So think about when you want to enable or disable certain components to help give clues to your users so that they know when they can do something with those input controls. So also, you want to think about providing feedback to your users when they have to use these input controls. How many times have you click a button and you sit there it's like wondering, is something happening, right? So how do you tell your users that what they did, right, actually worked? And then lastly, you want to work in plenty of error handling in this area, because after all, you're asking the users to touch your system. So you really, really want to think about how to prevent user errors at all costs. Then looking at the navigation components. So navigation components are there to help users move around, right, to navigate. So you can look at using tabs, look at side menus, using tags, search boxes, pagination controls, and even breadcrumbs. So the key here is to make sure that it is it's easy for the user to reach different places in your application, right? And then you also want to make sure that your user know where he is at any moment in time. Something to think about, right? I put it in here because I feel it. Whenever you have to hit the back button on anything, you really want to try to avoid that because a lot of times, when do you hit the back button? It's when I didn't find the thing that I was looking for. I have to hit back and try again. Maybe I made a mistake. Uh-oh, I got to hit back, and then let me start all over again. Or sometimes I'm just confused and I'm just clicking randomly and just trying to find what I need to find. So try to design your navigation in such a way that, users don't have to go backwards. Now, the informational components, these components are there to help keep users engaged and also to provide context to help aid the users. So think about, kind of context tooltips, showing progress, showing your system or an action status, and also alerts and notifications. These are all informational components. So when those are done well, it helps keep users engaged. Now, since we are inserting a lot of textual components here, pay extra care to make sure that you write in a very clear, concise, and meaningful manner. So, this is where, your spell check and your grammar are super, super important, and making sure that the users can understand your messages. So the last UI component is containers. These are used for grouping content together, and it's used for kind of organizing things so that things would look neat. Grouping related content together not only helps keep things neat, it also helps you maximize the use of your space. So when you think about mobile devices, this is very, very important because you have a very tiny screen to work with. So some examples of containers that you see, accordion. To me, that's just expand and collapse. So you can see these applications in navigation menus. Sometimes you see these in cards to be able to expand it to see more information. Another type of container is cards. So cards are used to group information for short pieces of information together, and they usually look like a physical card too. That's why they're called cards. And usually it will have some components within the cards for you to take actions directly or to go into, kind of like a full-blown page, right? To get, much more details. The third example of a container would be carousels, right? So it's kind of like cards, but it's really just a way for you to be able to scroll through content. So you can, pop it on the screen and be able to show quite a bit of content through that UI. Usually you would see maybe dots, right, to kind of indicate that, hey, you can see more, you can see more, you can see more, or you can see arrows, right, left and right to indicate that, hey, you can move left and move right, and you can keep scrolling. So, UI actually is not that complicated. It really is, kind of breaking down those four things and really think through your choices and where to put those choices in. Once you think through these components, one exercise that you have to do is to pull them all together to create a sample of what the UI would look like to the end user. And this exercise is called wireframing. But keep in mind, though, that wireframing is not your final product design. It is far from your final product. It's meant to be a sketch, right? What you're doing is to try to create a skeleton to convey your design ideas. You built wireframes so that you can use these to facilitate conversations with your stakeholders or other designers. Sometimes you would hear people call these things low fidelity design. Being low fidelity means that it's very sketchy, right? It's sometimes, and most of the time, it's done in black and white. For good reasons, right? Because at this stage, you want to keep the conversation, kind of to that, frame, right? You want to understand it, see if the skeleton is good enough. So you don't want to bring in colors to distract those conversations. When you start doing wireframing, you'll also hear people say, hey, prototyping. So wireframing and prototyping are similar, but very different activities with different goals in mind as well. So if you think, wireframing is putting the skeleton together, prototyping is slapping on the muscles and the skin, if you will. So you actually built something, right? You built out your ideas that would look closer to the end product. And the goal is that you have something that the users can actually touch and try, right? So it's somewhat workable. So let's take a breather, right? That's really it about user interfaces. We already established that doing user interfaces really well alone will not automatically give you good user experiences by default. So we kind of have to switch our brains a little bit and think about, okay, what else? What are the other things that we have to consider to really deliver good user experiences? So again, some of these questions are kind of a repeat of, what I learned, right? Asking yourself, did your solution work? Did the users like the solution? Do they want that solution? Can the users find it and use it? And the last one is kind of important too. Do the users trust your solution? So let's start with the more formal definition of user experience. So user experience is defined as how you interact with and experience a product or a service. And our goal as solution designers is to ensure that users have good experiences. Now, what are experiences, right? It is what you perceive. So, it's all made up in your brain, basically. So your senses, your five senses, right? Your thinking, your desires, they all come together to form your perception of any particular experience. So, perception is very, very personal thing, and it can be influenced quite easily sometimes. Things like maybe a sudden noise that kind of startled you, right? When you see a very difficult word that you don't understand, these are all conscious things that you can notice and will probably make you cringe, depending on the situation, right? Things like your personal upbringing, your culture, the biases that you may have. These are things that you don't even notice that constantly works in the background to influence how you perceive the world around you and your experiences. So let's look at some examples, right? Um, have you seen any doors that's just so confusing to use and you wish that they never existed? These are called Norman doors. I would also add that these doors are extremely embarrassing to use. That's how I felt when you try to push a door, get stopped, and then you have five other people behind you trying to get through. So it's very, very embarrassing. But why is it, confusing? Well, I don't know. Am I supposed to push on these or am I supposed to pull? Right? The best stores are the ones that you don't even realize that you had gone through. So a lot of those actions, the push or pull actions that you do, automatic, right? Somehow you just know, oh, there's some clue. You just know. You push and you go through. Another example, this is called a masochist pot. So it's a teapot that can offer you a third-degree burn, or it can offer you tea, all depending on how you want to look at it. It's not really useful, is it? Right? If you can hurt yourself in the process of using it. Hmm. Um, how about this one? When you think about it, something that's created from the designer's perspective may look very lovely. But what are the users really seeing from their point of view? Maybe that's not something that they want or how they wanted it. So, what is good user experience anyway? Right? Just kind of key things to look for. When your solution is relevant to the problem, relevant to the user's needs and wants, that will give you good UX, right? When that solution actually works, it actually functions the way that's expected to solve the problems. I can find it without trouble and I can use it without trouble. That's good. And you also want to have positive feelings associated with that as well. So this is kind of the extra oomph that you want to give your solutions, right? To kind of, hook onto some of those emotions and be able to trigger those. So how do you design? How do you design for good UX, right? You want to come in from different angles. And these are the 5 angles that you want to look at. Number 1 is looking from the human psychology angle. Secondly, looking at usability. Thirdly, looking at the design itself. Fourth is about the flow, right? And then last but not least, about analysis. And I'll walk through each one of these in good detail. So human psychology, people's minds can be manipulated. A lot of times you don't even know it, right? And it can be manipulated intentionally or unintentionally. So our job as designers is to be very, very intentional about how we influence the mind and hence how you influence the perceptions. In order to do that, though, you have to have a very good understanding of your users because not all users are the same, right? Given the context, their wants and needs are different. So user research is important, and that's something that you really need to do to help you establish all that. So some things to think about, right? Understanding motivation. You want to know why the users want or need to have a solution in the first place. Knowing exactly what they want is good, right? But in your solutions or in your messaging or in your marketing, you can also work in some ways to tell the users explicitly what they are gaining, what you're giving them, what is your value proposition, right? Sometimes users don't really know. Um, Expectations and assumptions. I think when users come in to any solutions, they always have something already established in their mind. So do you know what the users expect, maybe in terms of how much effort and time they have to spend in your solution, right? Are they always in a hurry, or do they have all the time in the world and they can spend a lot of time scrolling useless videos? What do they expect to see or do, right? What kind of assumptions or biases, right? This goes back to, some of the things that will impact perception unconsciously. What are some of those things that they bring with them? Would they work for your solution, or would they work against your solution? So, things to explore. The third thing that, I find is very, very interesting is about human behavior. Um, not only about how people learn, right? How people pick up a new behavior, but how do you make people repeatedly do the same thing over and over again? A lot is in play. When you talk about repeatable behavior. So you can do that in different ways. And I've kind of researched and found a couple interesting ones. So you can ponder on them. Um, you know, One way is to look at how people form habits. Okay, there is a very, very popular and powerful model out there that's called the hook model, that's used by a lot of companies. And in the deck, I have a link that kind of does a walkthrough with TikTok and kind of explain why TikTok is so successful with this model. So the basis of this model is this, right? It is a 4-stage process. So first, you want to identify some sort of trigger that calls for an action. Okay. And then the users will act with an anticipation of a reward. Okay. So the users are expecting something. Now, you have to offer a reward, but it has to be a variable reward. And what I mean by variable is that, well, it may be a different amount of reward, different quantity of reward, or different types of reward, right? It's not the same every time, right? It has to be variable. And then you also have, you provide them with some sort of opportunity to make some kind of investment so that they can do more work to get more reward. So that's kind of the basic model of the hook model. You can find this on a lot of platforms, social media platforms, especially, and TikTok being one of the examples. And think about it, casinos also kind of work similarly too. Another way to get people to do, to repeat behavior, gamification. You hear that a lot, but gamification is not just about giving them points and assigning them badges and allowing them to show it. There's a little bit more to it than just that. First of all, it's a crucial component is that you have to motivate your users, or find the motivation for the users to take some kind of action, right? And then with those actions, you want to be able to provide them some emotional feedback. And the key here is emotional. um, then the other crucial component is that you have to have some sort of progression in the challenges in order for it to be really called a game, right? I've never personally played a game that doesn't make progression. That's not a game in my mind. So that's just kind of the basics about gamification. The last point here, right? We kind of talked about trust. How do you make people trust you? Not at a personal level. I mean, personally, you can do a lot of things to make friends trust you, make your teachers trust you. But how do you do that through, something like a digital product, right? It is hard, but things to mull over. Be professional. So you have to project that image. Um, this is super important because I've seen things where, you expect a super high quality website and then you found some spelling errors. And it's just like, oh my God, what happened there? Right. So it will hurt your image, and it kind of broke that trust a little bit. You're wondering who is that guy behind there writing those things. You also want to use very simple words, right? Keep things simple, because when people don't understand you, they cannot trust you. So find ways to kind of get to your users level and make sure they understand. And then sometimes, you will get negative feedback. Not everybody will like you or your products. So choose to handle them with grace in public, right? As opposed to trying to defend it or try to sweep that under the rug. It will help you earn trust from your users. Um, so, these are just some basics. I think psychology itself is such a huge topic, and there's a lot of interesting things out there. So hopefully these are just some of the high level things that can kind of get you started, and you can start doing some more research and learn more about them. Second component that we really want to talk about in user experience design, this is a big one, is about usability. Okay, usability is a quality attribute that assesses how easy user interfaces are used. So you want to, your goal is to reduce the cognitive load of your users. So in plain English, so everyone can understand, it just means make it easy for the users. Don't make them think, right? Try to foolproof things for them. There are 5 key quality attributes of usability. Okay, number one is called learnability. Sometimes you will hear discoverability used interchangeably. So this is about how easy is it for someone to pick up something on first try without any help. So you may have heard this phrase or this quote that user interfaces are like a joke, right? If you have to explain it, it's no good. So ask yourself, when you draw up your wireframe, right? Um, would the user understand without reading any help documentation? Um, can you solve problems by doing something very common and simple, right? So try to use common conventions that people already know, and try to use as much of those as you can to solve the problems. So make it intuitive, right? And then also provide feedback to the users so that they know, oh, I can, if I click this is the feedback that tells me, oh, it works, right? So then they will learn it. The second attribute you want to look at is called efficiency. This is thinking about how quickly you can get users to perform whatever they need to do once they learn how to use it. So, first thing you think about, right, because we're, IT here, system performance definitely comes into play here, right? It will impact the efficiency if your systems do not perform well. Making sure that whatever you present and put out in the UI, you have visual clarity. Can I easily read the text or the charts that I put on the screen? Um, can I get get to the information that I need easily, right? Are the goals or the call to action hard to miss? Like it's right there in your face. You cannot miss it, right? So you don't have to spend time looking for it. Did you give everything that the users needs to accomplish their goal? Or do they have to spend time go around to multiple pages to get to all of those? So these all impact efficiency of the usage. The third thing is about memory, memorability. It's about how easily can the user pick something back up after not using it for a period of time, right? Memory is interesting. You say you trust your memories. I say you should never trust it. You absolutely do not trust your users to remember things. So try to help them in every way that you can. Things like, having those tooltips, right, to remind them, oh, this field is used for this. Or you want to try to help them recognize things versus trying to make them recall. An example would be if I asked you, what is the capital of Egypt? It's hard. I don't know if anybody can recall that, but if I frame it a little differently, is Cairo the capital of Egypt? Now you have a higher chance of actually answering that question. Okay, so try to use more of the recognition versus recall. Okay, one way is keep your usage of icons consistent, right? So you always remember this means this, and doesn't matter where you go, it always means the same thing. The fourth thing is about errors, and we kind of touched on that a little bit. is really reduce the chances that your users will make errors. And in the case where you cannot prevent these errors from happening, can you reduce the severity of the errors? Things like putting in some validations as they're entering, free-form text, or clear cues on whether an image is clickable or not. It is embarrassing. I do click on a lot of images that actually cannot be clicked. So number 5, satisfaction, right? Again, this is, about the emotional response that you want your users to have, and look for ways to trigger them, right? So UI looking pleasing, right? You happen to pick the right palette for the user. They like the color. That's great, right? When the users can do what they need to do in your application, that's even better, right? If they can repeatedly do it without help, but that is really fantastic. Now, can you push yourself and think of ways to put in some pleasant surprises, right? Some of those wow factors, things that they did not really expect, but it's really nice for them. That will bring the satisfaction up. I like surprises. So, okay, let's jump to design. Design is mainly addressing utility. And depending on what you're designing, you want to address safety. Think about the pot there, right? When utility meets usability, you have something useful. So think about how to use the right tools for the right job, right? Stick with some common conventions if possible. Check that your components, whatever you put into your UI are indeed needed to solve the problem. So really try to keep things simple, right? Don't have components that don't really serve any purposes. Okay. But also design also covers the aesthetics. Aesthetics are important. Someone has told me, when something looks nice, you automatically like it more. Sometimes even when it doesn't work. I don't agree with that, but somebody has told me that before. So I would say it's an add-on thing that you really want to do for your products. So try to come up with material design template up front, so that you can try to keep everything consistent in terms of your colors and material design. Those will feed into the aesthetics. You want to pick colors that would look and feel consistent to your product message or your brand message. So if those things are already established, right, you have a brand, you have brand logo, you have brand colors, think about how you can leverage that so you can, associate those brand feelings in your product. So this is where your artistic side can really kick in and do a lot of good things here. But I like to always strike a balance, right? There are times you have to make design choices. And if you have to make choices between utility and aesthetics, I would say you always choose utility over aesthetics, right? So as you can see, yeah, things can look pretty, but if they're not functional, no good. Okay. What is flow? Flow is about the journey, the user's journey from point A to point B, and how you want to guide them from point A to point B and accomplishing a goal, right? So that is what you want to do with your flow design. So you want to design your flow so that it's very clear and concise. So meaning the path to the goal is easy and it's quick. So sometimes you may hear people say, hey, you can write user stories to help you kind of visualize the journey. So if you hear that, don't confuse these user stories with the other kinds of user stories that you have to do, which is, more about the functionality and capturing requirements. So this is kind of like drawing up a storyboard, right? I have a user that will come in and they expect to see XYZ. So they will land on the landing page and see this information. Then they will make a choice and decided to hit these tabs to go do XYZ. So this is kind of what those stories may sound like. So another thing you want to do in this phase is to design the information architecture. Information architecture is about providing structure for your information. So you want to think through how you want to structure that to facilitate the flow that you want your users to go through. So the first thing is to think about content grouping. You want to think about maybe by the types of contents that you have, right? Or by the goals that you want to achieve. And here are some examples of how you can group content. You can try to group them by categories. So think about e-commerce sites, right? They have, lots and lots of products, and you have some sort of product hierarchy to group them. Another way is to group your content by tasks. So think about maybe some of the banking apps that you may have experienced, right? It's very, very task oriented. Think about maybe just a simple search like Google, because there's just so much information and so many different types of information. Maybe you can, group your content by time. So these are kind of like your social media apps, some of the social media, maybe grouping by people as well. So there are those applications like Tinder or Pet Finder. So people and, pets. So once you decide on how you want to group your information, then you want to think about how you want to relate those groups. Okay. So this is, where you kind of think about the information hierarchy, right? And you have two choices, really. You either go deep or go flat in that hierarchy. So when I say flat, think about YouTube. Okay. You have just a handful of choices on your menu, right? Not a whole lot, but when you click into each menu item, right, then you contain, quite a bit of content. So that's a flat hierarchy. As opposed to deep is like an e-commerce site. That's a great example where, you group your content, in a hierarchical fashion, and usually, maybe 5, 6 levels deep. Try to pick one. One strategy, right? Don't try to do both. It will get really confusing. Sometimes you might hear some designers say, hey, I'm going to make sure that users can do XYZ with a set number of clicks. I personally feel like that is a good guideline, a good way to kind of gauge, you don't want to go super deep and people have to click 10, 15 times. But there's no hard rule, right? And that's why it makes it difficult. So think of it this way. It doesn't matter whether you go flat or go deep, as long as you make sure that the users are clear where they are at any point in time, right? Where they are in that information hierarchy. And they're extremely clear about where they can go. Those, try to focus on those things. It's much more important than, counting the number of clicks. Okay, so last but not least, we have this analysis component that you want to consider when you're designing user experience. We kind of talked about user research, right? There are times where you need to understand your users more. You want to, kind of get into knowing, their habits, their motivations, expectations, a lot of things about them. You can build user profiles. I think user profiles are very useful, kind of gives you a synopsis of, what your user is like. But again, stick with, don't try to just do demographics, right? When you see something that says, hey, 30 to 35-year-old male, have kids, that doesn't really give you a whole lot of information about your user. So dig deeper, be more specific. Questionnaires, interviews are some of the ways that you can conduct user research and get more information. They have their pros and cons. And depending on situation, you have to pick the right way. And then also just observe if you have that opportunity, just kind of observe what users do. That's one way to do research. Second thing is how do you actually validate and test your design, right? It's great that you understand the users and you think by putting in those UIs, right? By putting in your information architecture, that it's actually going to solve their problem. How do you validate that? Prototyping, I kind of mentioned that, is one way to help you test and validate. And this happens early on, right? You start creating something that the users can try out and you get those early feedback. Or when your product is a little bit more developed and you want to go through some sort of more formal usability testing. So there's, I have some references for you at the end that can go, into more details about different ways to run usability tests. Lastly, how does your solution perform in the real world? Is it doing what you are expecting when you are throwing it out into the wild? A lot of times we don't think about this, right? I'm done with my solution. It's done and it went to production. No, your job is not done. So think about how you want to measure and how to measure success, right? Because it's important to get feedback from the real world and come back and actually iterate and keep improving things. So things that you can do are satisfaction surveys. I get a lot of those from e-com sites, and maybe analyzing the usage, right? Depending on what kind of applications you're using. Some of the metrics that I've seen, rate of conversion, right? 100 people went to your site, but only 2 people actually went through and made a purchase, for an example. That's not a really good, not really good success there. So last words, really, remember, always remember that people ignore designs that ignore people. So make sure you ask those questions, understand your users, and really, kind of get into their minds, understand what they want. So with that, this is the end of my presentation. I want to give my contact out here in case there's anything that that is unclear. Feel free to reach out. I would love to help out in any way. Lastly, just some references that you may find helpful if you want to explore these topics further and, and also deeper, and then, a couple pages of that. The last one is the book that I kind of talked about, that talked about the hook model. So, feel free to utilize these to help you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faye. We'll give people time if any of them have any questions. I just want to mention a fun thing in the meanwhile. This book, Hook, has been written by Nir Ayal. And Nir Ayal, after writing this book, which became really, really popular and a go-to book for many companies, has now written a book which is called Indistractable. So how to take care when all these hooking products take time away from you and may lead you astray. Okay, Alex, you have raised a hand. Please go ahead.
Faye, I just want to tell you thank you for this awesome presentation. I've always seen UX or UI in the signature block of some coworkers, and I never really understood what it was. And you really explaining this, I was like, oh my gosh, that's like awesome stuff going on.
Thank you.
Go talk to those people. Yeah, really, thank you. This you laid it out very concise, and yeah, you brought a lot together and some terms that I wasn't familiar with before. I understand a lot more. So thank you.
Sure thing. Thank you for the feedback.
Okay. Yeah, we just typically, it's like some of them, and I'm going to just repeat in the meanwhile. I could kind of look at people here. Can you please add the names of your teams to your name so that we know? Some of you have done it already, but there are quite a few. So it's easier for us to track. Is there a raised hand? It's only Alex, right? No, Ashwin, you have raised your hand now. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Faye. Thank you again for the wonderful talk. I had a question. I'm sorry, it's actually related to our submission, but I was wondering what it was. There is a mention of a UI UX architecture for our submissions. Could you tell us what that is, or what's expected from us?
Shrikant, I'll let you take that
So,
one.
okay, sure. I was just waiting, like if you're going to tell about some generic things. But Ashwin, if you look at the document that has been sent, in the addendum part of that document, there is an example. So UI UX architecture primarily will contain some of the things that Faye mentioned. Not all of it, because a lot of things she was talking about is how you make those decisions. But what you will have is, first of all, the actual UI screens, that is, call them wireframes or whatever you want to talk about. Now, when we say that, and in the document it says, you are not going to make an effort to put all, like if you're going to have 23 screens in your application, you're not putting 23 screens in the architecture level. The key ones. And the second part is what Faye called the flow and the navigation. So how will the major functionality be achieved through the various screens that you are thinking of? Now, these are two visual parts of your UI UX architecture. The other component, as always, is the quality attributes. Primarily, when you think of UI UX, it becomes, one is about the access control and the security. How are you going to address those will be described. But that's not drawing, it is the description. Like how are you addressing those will, how, if you have different types of users, then how are you going to design that? Once again, this is architecture, so it's not like you have all the last level of details. You say what kind of roles and how will you define the access for them. We are not trying to list all the users and all the access. Okay, so that's my response. If you have any follow-on, please feel free, Ashwin. Does this make sense to you?
Yes, yes, it does. Thanks, Srikanth.
Sure. Okay, I don't think that we are going to give that deck to Raj, but the rest of you will get it. Okay, I'm having some fun here. I know Raj, so I'm just saying it. Yeah, we will. What we will do is we'll put the deck. Faye, you are okay with it, right? I'm just saying it on your behalf. We'll put the deck on the drive where we share other documents and then send the link to all of you. Is that okay, Faye?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Then we'll do that. Yes, Ashwin, go ahead.
Yeah, so this one's actually for Faye. I've been in situations where I don't know what's the line between like a wireframe and a final design. Like when do we need to do that? When do we go from a wireframe to a final design that you give to the developers, which is very specific, that this is a button, these are the colors, this is the template we'll use?
Okay, so the way that I look at it is the wireframe is again, I call it a sketch, right? So this is the very early stages, and what you want to capture in the wireframe are, the major ideas, right? So yeah, absolutely, that's not enough detail for the developers, right? Because you have to be very, very specific with your requirements there. So I would say wireframe is, when you start conceiving the idea, right? You put it down in the wireframe, and then you have other processes to define, the requirements for each of those components, and that's what you hand off to the developers. Wireframe is, actually, I think it's more useful for facilitating design conversations, right? It is part of the documentation, but that's something that you can pull up and talk to your stakeholders, and that can help you talk about the components in the design, right? That's what I feel like.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, Faye, if you don't mind, you can stop sharing the screen so that we'll have a gallery view of whoever is on the call. Thank you. Yeah, I think there is a raised hand and a question in the chat. So yeah, feel free to ask the question. In the meanwhile, I'll look at the chat question.
Hey, hi, Faye. Thanks for the great session. The question is for you. Like you have mentioned, you do wireframing and prototyping, but before before rolling out the product, how do you take the feedback when you are not actually rolling out to the users directly? I mean, how do you take the feedback and make the changes?
Sorry, I had trouble finding the unmute button. Help me understand. So you're wondering when you're not getting feedback directly from users, how do you come back and make changes? So I would say, you know, there's a business stakeholder, you know, in a lot of these projects, right? So when you don't have access to the end user, go to your business stakeholder and try to find someone that can provide feedback. Because I've experienced a lot where when you don't get any feedback from anyone, not even the business stakeholders, the products don't turn out well.
Okay.
Yep.
Good. Thank you.
I'm going to add one more thing to it. Like if you are designing a product, which means you are coming up with your own idea, like in this particular problem that you are solving, right? So what you would have to do is do things like market research on what kind of things are being done, and also define some people who you will say are your go-to people to get feedback. And they might be people like Faye, for example. She's not your stakeholder, but she is a UI UX expert. So you'll say, hey, we are trying to design something like this. Does this look good? And they'll give you feedback. So business stakeholders, and then if you don't have those also when you are building the product, you'll want to find those UI UX experts or identify a set of people to whom you will go. Okay, I think there is a question here, Faye, where does animation come in the UI UX design and how important are they?
I think this is more of an opinion, and I have some basis for my opinion. I think animation is very distracting. So I mean, personally, when I design, I try to minimize those, right? Because again, you go back to the utility. Does it serve a purpose, right? And use that as a basis to determine, well, if the animation will serve a purpose, right? Are you trying to grab somebody's attention to that particular spot, for example? Then maybe animation is one way to do it, right? So always think about the why before you say, well, is it important? Well, it depends.
Okay, any last question? Okay, thank you all. Thanks a lot, Faye, once again. And all of you feel free. Faye is really a people's person, as she mentioned in the beginning. So when she gave her email ID, it was not lightly. She will be happy to answer questions. When I asked her, she said, yeah, sure, I can share it so that you don't have to go through the competition process to just ask those kind of questions. Okay. These are relations which go beyond that. So feel free. And in case you missed it, it's a simple email ID, the first letter of her first name followed by the last name, fwong@costco.com. That's what she provided. I'm just repeating it.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you all. And until next time, you'll see another email coming to you by tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Faye, I'll talk to you tomorrow again.
Sounds good.